SpaceX suffers another issue with Falcon while its Raptor engine breaks records. ULA's Vulcan also suffers an issue in flight. Earth gets a new moon, sort of. And is Starship's next launch less than 10 days away? All that and more coming up this week in spaceflight. Earth has a tiny new moon. Well, more or less. But it's not at all like the big old chunk of cheese that we're used to. This new moon is actually a small asteroid called 2024 PT5, and it will linger close to Earth for a few months. Close enough, in fact, that it can actually be considered a temporary moon. The asteroid was discovered on August 7th by the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, or ATLAS. This is a system developed by the University of Hawaii to scan the night sky for asteroids that could potentially impact our planet and provide early warning in case they're on a trajectory that could pose any danger to us. But no need to worry, this new asteroid won't collide with Earth anytime soon. ATLAS has 4 telescopes, 2 in Hawaii, 1 in Chile, and 1 in South Africa. It's this last telescope that first discovered our new moon last month. But is it really a new moon? Well, it's a little complicated. Some asteroids orbit the sun on trajectories that are very similar to Earth's orbit. If such an asteroid gets close to Earth, it can be temporarily captured in orbit around our planet, and then it becomes a mini-moon. Really, that's what astronomers call it. And this does happen occasionally. In 2020, an asteroid was discovered that had been a mini-moon for a couple of years, but it left Earth shortly after its discovery. I guess it got a little shy from all of the attention. Not all of these mini-moons stay for a long time, though. Some of them don't even complete one full orbit, but are still captured by Earth's gravity for a while. Astronomers call these events temporarily captured flybys, and we actually had one of these visitors back in 2022. It turned out it was irregular. This asteroid had been temporarily captured in the 80s and is now expected to return in 2051. The newly discovered asteroid, 2024 PT5, is currently experiencing one of these temporarily captured flybys, and before confirming that we've got a new celestial companion, astronomers had to make sure it really was an asteroid. But what else could it have been? Well, the object is quite small, only 10 meters across. At that size, it could be something like an expended rocket stage. For some missions, these are left in a very similar orbit, and they are in fact occasionally confused for asteroids. That might sound silly, but in 2015, a new mini-moon was announced that was expected to stay around for 5 years. Unfortunately, the astronomers had to retract their announcement a few hours later. It turned out that they had discovered the European Space Agency's Gaia spacecraft. Whoops. This time, astronomers are more confident and believe that it's an actual asteroid, as the object closely resembles our visitor from 2022, and its trajectory makes it unlikely to be a spacecraft or a rocket stage. Instead, NASA suspects that it might be a large rock that was ejected from the moon's surface a long time ago during an asteroid impact. The asteroid will stick around for some time, with the captured flyby ending on November 25th. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see it as it's very small and 9 times farther than our regular moon. Regardless, there will be 2 moons in the sky, even if only for a few months. Rocket Lab finally showed off its new Archimedes engine. In a video released this week, we can see the engine breathing fire on the test stand at NASA's Stennis Space Center, and there's a lot to unpack. Archimedes is powered by methane and liquid oxygen. During the nearly half-a-minute burn shown in the video, we see some of the blue and purple hues associated with those propellants in the engine's exhaust. But the video also shows some colors that we usually don't like to see. In particular, there are sometimes some green streaks in the exhaust, which can often be a sign of the engine destroying itself. Our writer Alex noticed those streaks and asked Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck on social media what was up. Beck explained that some of it is the engine's starting fluid, or TTEB, which indeed burns with a green flame. But other streaks are, quote, slight copper erosion due to a localized flow trip. Copper erosion usually means that the engine is trying to destroy itself, so that's not great. This engine clearly survived the test, but Beck said that Rocket Lab has a fix in place for the next engine. Beck also revealed that this next engine, testing engine SN2, will make its way to the test stand next week. According to Beck, Rocket Lab has been rotating between different engines on the test stand to make tweaks, and SN1 and 3 will be back on the stand again soon. Of course, Archimedes is still in development, and that's also the phase in which to find issues like these. So far, the test campaign hasn't run into major issues yet, but Rocket Lab might at some point push the engine beyond its limits. Or, as Peter Beck said it, quote, sorry, no explosions so far, but we are working on it. That's normal too. A few days later, Rocket Lab also shared its progress on Neutron, the rocket that Archimedes will eventually power. Neutron has a reusable first stage that will be outfitted with 9 of these engines. Well, this week the company showed off a completed common dome for the propellant tanks on this stage. This dome separates the liquid oxygen tank from the methane tank. This is just one of the many components that need to be completed before Neutron's first flight next year. A few months ago, Rocket Lab announced that all components for the rocket were either in production or testing, but nevertheless, there's still a long way to go before the company is ready to show off a completed rocket. Until then, it's good to see progress and amazing to finally see an Archimedes engine fire. We hope to see many more of these tests, successful or not, because let's face it, they're awesome either way. As Neutron's launch date approaches, there is another Methalox rocket with the launch potentially closer than we might think. Hey Ryan, what's going on with Starship?
Well, Elysia, this week we got an interesting update on Starship's next launch in the form of a NOTMAR, a Notice to Mariners. To be more precise, this was a local Notice to Mariners, or LNM, from the Coast Guard, which is issued every Wednesday. This particular LNM applies to the waters off the Gulf of Mexico, and the one released this week showed a warning of impending rocket launch operations near Boca Chica, Texas. According to the notice, these operations would be taking place daily between October 12th and October 19th, with the windows beginning at 7 AM Central Time on all of the days and closing at either 8:10 AM Central or 8:40 AM Central, depending on the day. Of course, unless suddenly some other rocket company has secretly built another launch site in Boca Chica, the launch operations this notice refers to is SpaceX's Starship. If you've been following along, SpaceX has been preparing for the last 4 months to launch the 5th flight of its Starship rocket. This flight, however, has seen regulatory delays in the last several weeks. This was as a result of changes that SpaceX had made to its plans in mid-August that prompted the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, to initiate consultations with other agencies before signing off on a new license for this mission. Just 3 weeks ago, the agency stated that, quote, a final license determination for Starship Flight 5 is not expected before late November 2024. So given these new notices this week, what does the FAA say? Well, we went ahead and asked them, and the response was that there was no change, that statement still stands and the agency still does not expect the license to be done until late November. That, of course, is the current situation, and things could change such that this expected timeline is brought forwards. It's still worth noting, though, that nothing is set in stone. We already have past experience from Starship's second flight of these marine notices being released months before the actual flight took place. We in fact made a video back then explaining what are all the usual signs that we look for to guess when the next Starship launch might be. Alex's flight's not one of those. Furthermore, new road closures for Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday suggest SpaceX may be trying to perform more full-stack testing next week, perhaps maybe a full wet dress rehearsal. With all of this in mind, it's definitely going to be a nail-biting wait until things get more firm. One thing is for sure though, whenever SpaceX goes for it, we'll be covering it live. Now, back to you, Elysia.
Thanks, Ryan. And I'm sure everyone watching is super excited to see that launch. I certainly, for one, can't wait for it. Now, in other news, something else though that we really can't sit around waiting for is dealing with space debris, which we've actually been talking about in some of our recent episodes. There are a few companies and government agencies out there that are trying to tackle this issue, and just recently, both NASA and ESA have funded different missions with the goal of better handling this situation. NASA's SPICY mission, SPICY standing for Small Spacecraft Propulsion and Inspection Capability, was recently given a push forward by awarding Starfish Space the contract to develop and build the spacecraft that will carry it out. Starfish Space will receive up to $15 million over the next 3 years to build and operate one of its Otter spacecraft. Otter is a small satellite servicing and debris removal satellite that the company has been developing for the last several years. The main goal of NASA's SPICY mission is to visit and inspect multiple US-owned inactive satellites that are still in orbit. This will allow the agency to gather key information about how to approach these uncontrolled objects in a safe manner and investigate their condition after many years left adrift in space. We've all seen rendezvous and dockings to the International Space Station, and they're done regularly, but the station is a controlled vehicle with well-known orbital parameters and attitude. If we want to get rid of orbital debris in the future, there needs to be see much more research and testing on how to safely approach other spacecraft that are in unstable conditions. Similar tests have already been carried out recently by other companies like Astroscale, which sent its ADRAS-J spacecraft on a rendezvous with the spent upper stage of an H-2A rocket. But what will happen when a bunch of this debris gets removed and now starts to re-enter and rain down on us? Is there a way to reduce the chances of it harming people on the ground? Well, that's what the European Space Agency is trying to investigate on its DRACO mission. DRACO is another fun acronym which stands for Destructive Re-Entry Assessment Container Object. This mission will study the dynamics by which objects break up and burn up on re-entry by actually flying an object with the goal of it re-entering and burning up in the process. The agency recently awarded Deimos, a Spanish satellite company, a €3 million contract to build and develop said object. Just like with so many other space-related things, there's just no way of accurately replicating re-entry conditions here on Earth. So this object will be heavily instrumented, with data stored in a small capsule inside of it meant to survive the re-entry. Once past re-entry, the capsule will deploy a parachute and beam back all of its data to the ground before impacting the ocean. The goal is that by carrying out missions like this one, there will be more data on how to make spacecraft that are fully demisable on re-entry and will leave no big chunks that could survive and hit the ground. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because SpaceX has already done this with Starlink satellites, which are made of materials meant to fully burn up on re-entry. Of course, the more organizations that do this, the better for everyone on Earth, as well as our future in space. So here's hoping that we see a lot more of it really soon. Now let's take a look at some other stories across space, and to start off, we'll head to SpaceX's McGregor test site in Texas. This week, the company fired one of its powerful Raptor engines for nearly 15 minutes. Yes, 15 minutes! To be precise, the burn lasted 897 seconds, blowing any other engine test length at McGregor completely out of the park. Ever since we started streaming our McGregor live feeds, the longest that we've seen a Raptor firing was way back in June 2022, when a Raptor fired for 385 seconds, which is still less than half the duration of this test. This 15-minute burn was even longer than the longest test that we had observed at McGregor to date, which was with the Falcon 9 second stage in November of 2023. That one fired for 454 seconds, still about half this length. So this puts into context how rare this test was, and it's very likely SpaceX was just trying to push the limits of the engine, but of course still within the limits of the ground systems. Similar tests have been done on other engines for that purpose, such as the RS-25 from the shuttle. One of them was fired for 33 minutes all the way back in 1988. Will we see SpaceX push Raptor for even longer burns? This week, NASA made more progress toward the next Artemis mission, Artemis II. The massive mobile launcher one that supports the propellant load and launch of the agency's SLS rocket was rolled from Launch Complex 39B all the way to the vehicle assembly building. This mobile launcher had been at the launch site since summer of last year. Teams have been working extensively on it since it supported the launch of Artemis 1 back in November of 2022, refurbishing it ahead of the next launch. Artemis 2 will be the first SLS launch with people on board, which means additional work and testing is needed. This included testing the new emergency egress system, the deluge system, actuating the rotation of the crew access arm under different loads and speeds, and much more. With these hundreds of tests now complete and all the upgrade work finally finished, the platform is no longer needed at the pad, hence its return to the VAB. The schedule for Artemis 2 is still uncertain as it's pending the resolution of the ongoing investigation on Orion's heat shield, but if all goes well, stacking of SLS could begin in the following months. Voyager 2's science capabilities have been reduced recently due to NASA's decision to turn off its plasma science instrument. The spacecraft, launched all the way back in 1977, is fitted with a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, often called RTG, which takes advantage of the thermal energy from radioactive decay of plutonium and turns it into electricity. RTGs allow spacecraft to operate without the need for solar power, but their power decays over time as the radioactive source decays. This lack of power was the main driver for NASA to turn off this instrument. But don't fret, there are still 4 more instruments working on Voyager 2, and NASA expects it, and its twin, Voyager 1, to have enough power to run at least one science instrument well into the 2030s. Over time, the agency has had to turn off instruments on both spacecraft either because of their dwindling power source or because of aging components and malfunctions. Coincidentally, Voyager 1 has been down to just 4 science instruments since 2016, so now both are on par. It's certainly not going to be easy to bid farewell to these spacecraft when it's time for their final transmissions, but for the moment, we can enjoy a few more years of interstellar science. The sun has been going crazy this week. Just yesterday, October 3rd, we had the largest and most powerful solar flare of the current solar cycle. The solar flare, classed as an X9.0, originated from region 3842, which has been quite active in the last few days. On the previous day, October 2nd, there was another powerful flare which was classed as an X7.1. Solar flares are powerful bursts of electromagnetic radiation that the sun releases, and X-class flares are the most powerful of them all. Alongside them, some can also carry a coronal mass ejection, which often takes a few days to arrive to Earth and can disrupt our planet's magnetic field. In fact, NOAA has published a geomagnetic storm watch for this weekend, sounding the alert of the increased geomagnetic activity. This means that we once again will get some spectacular aurorae on the higher end of the mid-latitude regions, so if you're in those areas, get ready for the possibility of an amazing show. If, on the other hand, you happen to have some satellites in space, take care of them. And from space weather to space traffic, here's Ryan with your weekly space traffic report.
Starting off the week, right as I was editing the previous episode, we had the launch of a Changzheng 2D rocket from China. Liftoff took place on September 27th at 10:30 UTC from the Zhouchen Satellite Launch Center, carrying the Tian-19 spacecraft to a low Earth orbit. Tian-19 is an experimental satellite developed by the China Academy of Space Technology, fitted with a recoverable capsule capable of flying up to 15 times. This satellite is capable of carrying about half a metric ton of recoverable payload and up to 200 kilograms of unrecoverable payload. Not a lot of details are known about its cargo other than it is carrying a variety of experiments on board, such as breeding of plants in space, testing of materials under different space conditions, and testing of new space technologies. To wrap up the month of September, we had another crew flying to the International Space Station, and this time on a Crew Dragon spacecraft. Liftoff of Crew Dragon Freedom atop a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket took place on September 28th at 17:17 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. On board Freedom were Commander and NASA astronaut Nick Hague and Mission Specialist and Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gerbanov. This mission was a peculiar one for a myriad of reasons, some good and some bad. The first peculiarity was that this was the first Crew Dragon mission to take place from Space Launch Complex 40. This is a capability that SpaceX has been working on for the last couple of years, and it has finally been realized. The reason to launch from this pad and not from Launch Complex 39A, as has been the case so far, is because SpaceX is preparing to launch from there a Falcon Heavy with NASA's Europa Clipper. That's not the only peculiarity though. If you've noticed, the number of crew members is 2 instead of the usual 4. That is because this mission will be bringing home NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, who launched on board Boeing's Starliner spacecraft back in June. As you probably know by now, NASA decided in late August not to return them on that spacecraft due to uncertainties in the reliability of its thrusters, although it eventually demonstrated that it was capable of returning home safely without crew. With that decision taken, both astronauts were incorporated into the crew of Expedition 71, and in fact, with the start of Expedition 72 last week, now Sunny commands the space station. You probably know that already if you watched last week's episode. After separation from Falcon 9's second stage, Crew Dragon Freedom took a 28-hour rendezvous profile to the station, where it docked to the front port on September 29th at 21:30 UTC. Since then, Butch and Sunny have already completed their full transition from using Endeavour, Crew 8 Crew Dragon as a lifeboat to using Freedom. The duo completed fit checks of their own SpaceX intravehicular activity spacesuits, emergency drills, and communication checks, deeming them and their equipment ready for a return if an emergency were to occur on the station. A nominal return, though, will have to wait until February of next year. With both now firmly assimilated into the crew of Crew 9, they'll be on the station until it is time for said mission to finish, which is, once again, next February. While Crew Dragon successfully travelled to the station, Falcon 9's second stage did not have so much of a success. After the spacecraft separation, the second stage was meant to perform a disposal burn that would have brought it over an area in the Pacific Ocean to the east of New Zealand. However, a few hours after Crew 9's launch, SpaceX announced on social media that this burn, while it brought the second stage down to the ocean, did not make it come down over the established safety corridor. This in turn prompted the company to pause all flights until they could understand the situation. This is not just because of a matter of safety, but also because of the potential that this could affect other missions going forwards. With interplanetary missions such as Hera or Europa Clipper coming up soon, it's quite important for SpaceX to figure out what happened to the second stage and why it didn't perform a certain burn the way it should. As expected, the issue also fell under what the FAA considers a mishap and therefore requires SpaceX to perform a mishap investigation. This makes it the third issue in the last 3 months with Falcon that has prompted such an investigation. But we know from those past instances that SpaceX doesn't necessarily need to complete those investigations before returning to flight. As it stands, the FAA allows companies to return to flight as long as the company demonstrates that public safety was never in any danger and that a preventative measure is in place that would not allow the issue to reoccur. This is what SpaceX did for the past 2 issues with Falcon, and in both cases, the company was able to resume flights after 2 weeks and 3 days respectively. So just given past experience, it's very likely this pause in launches will not take too long to end and we'll see soon Falcon 9 flying again. Despite the issue with the second stage, the first stage for this mission, B-1085, successfully completed its second launch and landing, returning back to SpaceX's landing zone 1 and bringing sonic booms across the Space Coast. With Crew 9's launch complete, the world ended September at 181 total launches, with the US still leading thanks to SpaceX. During the month of September, the company carried out 9 out of the total 23 launches that took place around the world. If this pace continues, it's very likely we're going to see last year's record-breaking number of launches worldwide being surpassed. That record currently stands at 221 total launches worldwide, and under current trends, it looks like we're going to be hitting around 240 launches by the end of 2024. Kicking off the month of October, we had the second launch of ULA's Vulcan rocket. Liftoff took place this morning, October 4th at 11:25 UTC from Space Launch Complex 41. The rocket was carrying an inert payload to a heliocentric orbit. This was Vulcan's second and last certification flight for the second phase of the Department of Defense's National Security Space Launch Contract, often shortened to NSSL. This mission was originally set to fly Sierra Space's Dream Chaser, but this spaceplane is not yet ready to spread its wings, so ULA instead had to fly an inert payload on board. This payload simulates the weight and mass distribution of a real payload, and because there are no real payloads on board, the company was able to add more experiments and technology demonstrators. These will be used to further upgrade and improve the Centaur 5 upper stage in the future. Vulcan's second launch flew a very similar profile to the first one, also fitted with 2 GEM 63XL solid rocket motors, a standard payload fairing length, and sending its Centaur upper stage into a heliocentric orbit. But speaking of those GEM 63XL SRMs, the plume appeared a tad asymmetrical on ascent. Shortly after liftoff, it appears a section of the right nozzle from this perspective burned through, and shortly after there was a bright flash with SRM bits flying everywhere. NSF's Dee Wise was able to capture an object that looks like a nozzle flying off, whilst Max Evans saw the vehicle tilt to the damaged side, requiring the BE-4 engines to correct the trajectory. Definitely not normal. Centaur 5's burn then lasted 20 seconds longer than planned, which is highly likely a result of Stage 1 underperformance. According to Tori Bruno on the official broadcast after launch, quote, "We had an observation." NSF has reached out to the Federal Aviation Administration for comment, and we're going to be keeping an eye on the words coming from ULA and the boss, Tori Bruno, so following us on the socials might be wise to keep up with this developing story over the next few days. ULA hopes that with this launch now completed, the Department of Defense will certify the rocket for NSSL missions in time to fly the first 2 of these before the end of the year. These 2 missions, USSF 106 and USSF 87, already have their payloads ready to go, and in fact, ULA and the US Space Force already started preparing them for launch before this certification mission took place. The company will not stop there though, as it hopes to launch up to 20 times next year, with a roughly even split between Atlas V and Vulcan missions. These missions will also see the activation of ULA's West Coast Vulcan launch site at Space Launch Complex 3. In recent weeks, ULA made progress at that launch pad, installing new ground propellant tanks and swing arms to be used on Vulcan. Going into next week, we're going to see another crew returning home from the ISS. With Crew 9 now on board the station, it's time for the previous mission, Crew 8, to come home. If the weather cooperates, this should take place as early as this weekend. NASA has yet to announce a final schedule, but current plans call for Crew 8 to depart the station on October 6th in the evening UTC. Crew Dragon Endeavour will then set for a splashdown off the coast of Florida the next day, October 7th, in the morning Eastern Time. Blue Origin is set to debut their second human-rated vehicle next week on Monday, October 7th at 1300 UTC with the launch of NS-27. This is to quote, meet growing customer demand, and it also looks like New Shepard's booster has a nice looking new livery. While SpaceX is still finishing its investigation into the Falcon upper stage issue, the company is proceeding with two very important missions coming up next week. The first of these will be ESA's Hera spacecraft being sent into an interplanetary course to meet with double asteroids Didymos and Dimorphos. That mission is currently planned to lift off no earlier than October 7th at 1452 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The other all-important mission coming up next week as well is the launch of NASA's Europa Clipper. This flagship mission is set to launch on board a fully expendable Falcon Heavy at full power from Launch Complex 39A no earlier than October 10th at 16:31 Universal Time. Apart from those two launches, SpaceX may also have on tap two other missions, Starlink Group 1010 and OneWeb 20, launching from Florida and Vandenberg respectively. However, due to the uncertainty in when the company may be able to return to flight and NASA imposing a 48-hour cutoff on launches before Europa Clipper, it's very likely that these won't happen until that mission takes place first. Of course, you won't have to wait for next week's report to know whether these launches took place or not, as you can keep up to date with the latest launches on nextspaceflight.com and also on the Next Spaceflight app.
And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and I'll see you all again next week to recap This Week in Spaceflight.